Hello, and welcome back to Zenin Fanfics. Today we're starting an exciting new series. What if Deku had gamer power? If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe for more content. The story we're featuring is written by Emrys Akayuki on fanfiction.net. You can find all the relevant links in the description, so be sure to check out the author's profile and say hello. Now let's dive into the story. Izuku Midoriya was an average 13-year-old child. Average height, average weight, and average green hair, but unfortunately for Izuku, there was one thing about his that wasn't average at all, something less than 20% of the population of the entire planet shared. He had no quirk. He had no super or preternatural abilities whatsoever. Just a few decades ago, the entire world was like Izuku, no abilities or powers, nothing, a world of normal humans through and through. Then one by one, unexplainable powers started appearing in humans and sometimes animals across the planet. The abilities consisted of everything from simple pyrokinesis to being able to bend time and space to a person's every whim. Of course, all of this meant very little to Izuku, seeing as it wouldn't help him somehow gain a quirk or help him achieve his singular life goal: to be a hero. Of course, at this point that sounded more like a faint fantasy than anything else. Izuku sighed to himself as he walked down the canal, taking the same route home from school that he had walked 100 times before. Under the bridge where the slime quirk user had attacked him, and past the place he had met his hero, All Might. Izuku paused in his walk and stared at the spot where All Might had jumped away all those months ago. There were still cracks in the ground from the force of the jump. They should send someone to fix that up, he thought idly. For a moment back, then he had considered clinging onto All Might before he left, just to get a chance to talk to him, to ask him if he could be a hero. Of course, that was ridiculous, and more than likely he would have gotten hurt, or at the very least have making All Might mad with his stupid questions. Of course, quirkless people couldn't be heroes. They'd die on the first day. Hell, he thought they'd die during the entrance exam. Entrance exam, the thought flickered through his mind. A horrible reminder of what was to come. At the start of the year, he had signed up to you, of the premier hero school in all of Japan, and easily one of, if not the best in all the world, and up until today, he had entertained the idiotic idea that maybe he could still do it. He had finished his final middle school exams just a few hours ago, and he was sure that he had passes with flying colors. He had always been smart. Izuku didn't know what he had been thinking. He should have switched out to a different high school, a normal one, months ago. But it isn't that easy to give up on a dream. Only moments after the exam had ended did his actions truly hit him. He let out another sigh, feeling as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. When he got home, he was going to have to SWCH school and probably beg for forgiveness. Perhaps that was why it was taking him such a long time to get home, why he had been standing in the same spot for almost 30 minutes now. When he got home, he would have to give up on his dream and settle in for a normal, a terrible, a boring life. His dream was dead. It was time to grow up and face the extremely depressing music. With that final thought, Izuku started walking again. He wondered what his mother would be making for dinner. He supposed that would be the most he would have to look forward to from now on. Lonnie had gotten home just under an hour ago. His mother had briefly inquired why he had taken so long. A short story about how nice the sun had looked in the evening had placated her. After that, he had retired to his room, which was where he was now. He lay down on his bed, phone in hand, a phone number highlighted on his computer, and him, staring at the ceiling, alone with his thoughts and anxiety, just as he had been for the last hour. He raised the phone up to his face for what must have been the 100th time that hour, and stared at the number for you. It already typed in. His thumb hovered over the green call button for a moment before he let his arm flop down against the bed again, just as it had every other time. Making a decision, Izuku let out a breath and turned his phone off, placing it on his bedside table. He wouldn't be getting over his anxiety tonight. With that, he turned over and closed his eyes. He would deal with it in the morning. Line, you have slept in a bed. Your HP and MP have been fully restored. What? Izuku started at the blue glowing box in front of his face uncomprehendingly. What? Izuku said to himself out of sheer disbelief at what he was seeing. He had gone insane, he thought. There was no way to develop a quirk at his age, besides the fact that he didn't have the DNA required to have one in the first place. Hesitatingly, he reached his hand forwards, almost reverently, towards the floating blue box, and managed to tap the X in the corner. It disappeared from existence instantly. Izuku blinked, and then stared at his finger. He had felt that the blue box wasn't just a hallucination, or if it was, he was far too gone to recognize it. So in conclusion, either he was unfathomable insane, or he had unfathomably developed a quirk, without the DNA, at age 13, 2 months before he was set to enter UA, and the very day he was going to beg for a SWCH of schools. It was perfect, too perfect. Then again, he considered maybe this was a way the universe was making up for all the shitty luck he had experienced in his lifetime. He shook his head rapidly. No need to get ahead of himself. First he had to experiment. Make sure that no, he wasn't insane, and that yes, he could use this quirk, whatever it did, to be a hero. First things first, Izuku thought to himself, what does it do? It didn't take him long to recognize the type of message that he had woken up to that morning. It was clearly like the ones that permeated the MMORPG worlds that Izuku Midoriya was intimately familiar with. When he had found out he didn't have a quirk, it felt like the world had ended. While other kids were playing with their friends and developing their quirks, he only had his videos. He spent his time watching and re-watching videos of heroes saving people, his mind racing with unattainable dreams and fantasies. It took months for him to snap out of it, or rather, for his mother to snap him out of it. One day, while he was wallowing in himself, staring at an image of All Might's first debut, his mother had come home with a box in hand. As it turned out, she had bought the latest game home for him to play in an effort to help him. Maybe it was just a nice gesture from a mother to her son, or perhaps it was out of guilt that she couldn't help him, that nothing she could do would do anything to ease Izuku's misery. But amazingly, the game worked. For weeks afterwards, he was staring at his computer, a grin on his face. Instead of hero videos, he played games, getting invested in fantasy worlds, feeling like he finally had some sort of place, however arbitrary it was. Shaking his head from his thoughts, Izuku stood up, walked to his computer, and turned it on. It was time to do some research. He smiled. Maybe his life was finally turning around. For 4 hours, Izuku Midoriya had relentlessly searched for any and all information he could find for any and all possible abilities he might have for his recently, impossibly developed quirk. Most of the information he could find was that which he already knew from his many years of finding escape in his video games. But he had to be sure. He had to cover absolutely all bases. This was a chance of a lifetime, the most important thing he would ever undertake, as long as he wasn't crazy. Although he had little information to go on, Izuku Midoriya wasn't suspected of once having an intelligence quirk for nothing. With only the message he woke up to that morning telling him his HP and MP had been restored, and he decided to put a pin in the fact he supposedly had magic until later, he had quickly determined that his gamer quirk probably wasn't anything along the lines of an FPS. From what he could find, and remember, the type of game he seemed to have been moved into was that of an RPG. Crafting levels, healing potions, skill trees, and most importantly, inventories. He could barely keep the grin off of his face. Not that he wanted to. If he was right, the applications for his ability, or even abilities, would be unfathomable. Izuku almost shivered in excitement. It was time to experiment. Now, how do I do this? Izuku muttered to himself. Do I need to focus on my inner energy? I've never had a quirk before, so I don't know how. If this was just a game, I'd press a button to open my inventory. But there's not button to Izuku's muttering tapered off as he noticed the blue box floating in front of him. No way, he said. Sitting there, floating in front of his face, was an inventory screen. It was easily recognizable. He had seen 100 times in his games. An outline of a character to the left with slots where the clothes would be, and a load of empty boxes to the left, waiting to be filled with loot. Except this box wasn't like the ones he saw in his games. The outline wasn't of a random character. It was of him, and the clothes in the slots weren't armor and enchanted necklaces. They were his clothes that he was wearing right at that moment. His quirk was voice-activated. His quirk was voice-activated. If it weren't for the incredibly situation he was in, Izuku would have burst out laughing. This was perfect. Not only would it make finding out and using all his possible abilities incredibly easy, it would also act as the perfect excuse as to why he was registered quirkless. What kind of person could figure out an unidentified quirk that could only be accessed through naming your abilities? But first thing was first. Testing. Thinking quickly, he picked up a shirt off the floor that he had thrown there the night before. Hesitantly, he leaned forwards and pushed the shirt into one of the inventory boxes. With a sudden flash of light, it disappeared from his hands, and a picture of a shirt appeared in the first inventory box. He grinned. It worked. He reached over to the left side player icon and tapped the picture of the shirt he was currently wearing and pulled it over to the one in the inventory slot. A common feature in most RPGs to easily SWCH armors and items was to pull one over the other and let go. An action that Izuku immediately undertook. In an instant and a flash of light, the shirt he had been wearing was replaced by the one he had stored. His grin stretched across his face as he rapidly switched back and forth between the two shirts for a few minutes, playing with his new ability. Wait, Izuku paused. Does this mean I have a pocket dimension? He froze, his finger hovering over the floating box as a thought rapidly came to him. It took half a second for his to rush across his room and find a pencil. Within a moment, he took aim at the floating box that had stayed on the other side of his room, reared back his arm, and threw. The pencil arced through the air and hit the box. With a flash, it disappeared, and another icon appeared on the screen. Quickly picking up another one, he threw again, and once more it disappeared, the number 2 coming into existence in the corner of the pencil icon. So they stack. That's good to know. Izuku's mind raced as he thought of the possible applications of his ability. In essence, he could make anything disappear in a thin air, only to receive it later. Something in his mind clicked. It could be used as a shield. Anything flying through the air could be instantly blocked and contained. Anything flying through the air. The shock that had taken over his face was immediately replaced with yet another grin. Bullets fly through the air, he said to himself slowly, the joy easily evident in his voice. Izuku Midoriya was immune to bullets. Well, he considered, as long as I have this in front of me. His realizations could be pondered on later. He still had the rest of his abilities to figure out. Walking across the room, Izuku switched his shirt back to the clean one and dispelled the inventory box before walking over to his desk and pulling out a fresh notebook and another pencil. He had gotten a new notebook only 2 days ago to record all the new quirks he would be seeing at you. Of course, this was before he realized what a monumental mistake he had made. Had being the important word. With his new quirk, there was nothing that could stop him from going. There was nothing that could stop him from achieving his dream. There was nothing that could stop him from being a hero. But this wasn't going to be any other hero research book. This wasn't going to be another in a list of about 20 notebooks he'd written in about nearly every hero he had ever come by over the years. But this notebook wasn't going to be about other people, other heroes. This was going to be about him, his powers, his quirk, his heroism. It took him a few minutes to design a cool cover for the first page of the book and decide on a title to denote the importance of the thing. After he had finished nerding out about his own coolness, and he definitely didn't notice the irony in that statement, he finally set about doing what he had brought out the notebook for in the first place, to make a list of abilities he wanted to experiment with. Skills, health, magic, leveling quests, status options. The list wasn't very long, but he assumed that some parts of it would take up quite a lot of time, especially the magic bit. Something he was absolutely sure couldn't be possible. But then again, everything about this situation was impossible. Izuku glanced at his list again and then looked around his relatively small room filled with All Might memorabilia. There wasn't much space, and he grimaced. He didn't want to risk damaging any of his things. Some of them were limited edition. Line half an hour later, in a quick conversation with his mother to tell her he was going out for a walk, and Izuku was standing in a clearing in the nearby forest. He knew it well, seeing as it was the place he used to train when he was a kid. He almost snorted at the thought. Train. All I did was run around and punch the air. That was nothing. No, he thought, this is the time my training will take place. This is the beginning of my life. Izuku grinned and said the word that would change the world. Status, Izuku said, just as before a blue box appeared without warning before him. Name, Izuku Midoriya, level 542, 04%, title, the gamer race, human quirk, not applicable HP, 100 MP, 500 STR, 10 BIT, 9 DX, 12 INT, 34 WIS, 22 LUK, 2 points to spend. 0 Izuku Midoriya is a sad, shy child who dreams of being a hero. There is absolutely nothing special about him at all. In a world of superhumans he is without power, but now, with the help of the gamer, he believes that he can achieve his dreams. Can he? Or is it just a pipe dream? Izuku's eye twitched as he read the slightly insulting but undeniably accurate description of himself before he shook his head and refocused on the rest of the information. The gamer. So that was his title. He supposed it made sense, given his new abilities. Will it change? He muttered to himself, brain going into overdrive from the two words. If I get a job, will it become the title for that job? Like a hero. If I become a hero, will it say hero? Did it say high schooler before? He paused. Did it even exist before? Izuku let out a heavy sigh, as excited as he was to find out he had new powers and that he could, possibly, become a hero. The whole situation was still distressing. It was a wonder he hadn't passed out from shock or anxiety. Quirks didn't just develop. It wasn't a thing that happened. And Izuku should know, what with the hours upon hours that he had spent trawling the internet for ways to get powers. He ran a hand down his face slowly and turned back to the floating box. What is this? The number of questions he had would take days to write down. But he let out a small giggle. Maybe he'd figure more out by experimenting. Or maybe he was just looking for an excuse to play with his powers. Who could really say? Quickly he read through the list again. 10 strength. He blinked. Is that good? He sat down on a nearby rock, the screen following him and staying at eye level as he came to a sudden realization. I have no point of reference for any of this. Well, he thought, if I'm a totally normal guy, and given the fact I've never done any serious training in my life, then wouldn't my stats be average at best? Ping. The noise made him jump as another box suddenly appeared in front of him. Wisdom +1 for coming up with a logical explanation to your issue. You've gained 1 point. What? Izuku blinked rapidly before repeating himself. What? He could gain points just by thinking. Does this mean that if I worked out, I'd get points in my strength? Ping. Wisdom +1. Cool, Izuku said, although this one doesn't have the extra explanation. Was it just because it was the first one? He nodded to himself. That made sense. He glanced around him, almost expecting another box to pop up before refocusing back on his status, the other two boxes having disappeared by then. Name: Izuku Midoriya. Level 542. 0.4% title: The Gamer Race. Human quirk: Not applicable HP. 100 MP. 500 STR. 10 BIT. 9 DX. 12 INT. 34 WIS. 24 LUK. 2 points to spend. 0 Izuku Midoriya is a sad, shy child who dreams of being a hero. There is absolutely nothing special about him at all. In a world of superhumans he is without power, but now, with the help of the gamer, he believes that he can achieve his dreams. Can he? Or is it just a pipe dream? He noted that the wisdom stat had definitely gone up, so that proved the thing, whatever it was, worked then. Reading the list, Izuku's head lowered slightly. For an average person, he assumed his stats were all well and good, but for a hero, they were abysmal. He clenched his fist. If he was going to do this, then he should do it properly. He only had a month to train for the UA entrance exam, and he was not going to waste it. Although, LUK, too, he stared at the number that denoted his life. Given the fact that he was born without a quirk in a world full of heroes, it made sense that his luck would be so low, but the fact there was much more concerning. Does this mean that if I increase it, I'll get luckier? The ability to change his luck, or even just make himself luckier with points that would get, he assumed, with leveling up, was definitely broken, even godlike if he were to put enough points into it. Izuku shook the thoughts from his head. It wasn't the time to deliberate on something so far in the future. No, now it was time to train. Quickly he closed the box in front of him, walked to the middle of the clearing, and started stretching. First things first, he said, let's see what skills I have, if any, with the word a box appeared in front of him again. This one was empty, but for two boxes with stylized icons in the top corner. I have skills. He tapped the first box, and as he expected, it expanded, revealing what the skill was and what it did. Gamer's body, passive, level max you. The gamer have been gifted with the ability to life your life as a video game. Like a normal game character, you will not take any permanent damage. Your skills will never atrophy, and your HP and MP will be restored upon sleeping in a bed. Holy SHD, this was groundbreaking. This was amazing. This was the most incredible power anyone could ever have. I don't take any permanent damage. His hung open from the shock of the situation. I have to test this. Turning away from the box and toward a nearby tree, Izuku Midoriya reared back his fist before swinging with all his might into the wood. Thwack! The sound echoed through the empty clearing, perfectly mirroring the pain running down his arm. -5 HP. Holy F, that hurt. He exclaimed in an uncharacteristic show of vulgar language while clenching his damaged fist with his other hand. Oh God! Izuku shouted, why did I do that? It hurts so. His shouts trailed off, so the pain was gone. There was nothing remaining, no stinging or phantom pain, not even pins and needles from the impact. He let go of his hand and raised it to his face. There was nothing there. Holy SHD. It was true. He didn't take permanent damage. With the force he had hit the tree, overzealous as he was, should have destroyed his hand, and if he was stronger, he would have broken it. There wasn't even the beginning of a bruise. This is so cool. He breathed in awe, although I guess it doesn't get rid of the pain. He smiled weakly at that. Then he noticed that another box had appeared. His shout must have covered up the pinging noise that seemed to go with them. New skill created. Physical endurance. Passive. Level 1. 24. 46%. 1% less damage from physical attacks. Oh, my God. It was one awesome surprise after the other. Sudden new skill created from his idiot actions that had such an incredible effect. Less damage from physical attacks. He glanced at the 1%. Does this mean that if I get it to level 100, I won't take any damage? Could it be possible that someday in the future, he would be able to take a punch from All Might and it not do anything at all? Wisdom +1 apparently, so Izuku thought with amusement and awe. He quickly closed the alert and refocused on the skill box. If the first of my, he thought for a moment, innate skills is this incredible, maybe the other one is incredible too. Immediately Izuku tapped the second box and watched with excitement as it expanded. Gamer's mind. Passive. Level max you. The gamer have been gifted with the ability to life your life as a video game. As such, situations of great trauma or horror will not affect you, as they would not affect the player. You have a complete immunity to any and all psychological effect, both induced by trauma and special abilities such as quirks or dash. Izuku was frozen, reading the effects of his second skill. While the first was nothing short of miraculous, the second was almost enough to make him pass out, or it would be if his horror wasn't being pushed down by the very thing he was horrified by. He blinked rapidly before shaking himself out of his shock. While this explains why I haven't collapsed yet, Izuku chuckled weakly, his eyes still stuck to the text floating in front of him. He closed the skill box and sat down heavily on the ground. I'll think about it later. He let out a sigh and leaned back on the grass. Options. With the word, yet another box popped up in front of him. Audio graphics, gameplay well. If that wasn't disappointing after such a jarring moment a few minutes earlier, he didn't know what was. Especially given the fact that all but the gameplay option were grayed out, indicating that, by general video game logic, they couldn't be accessed, and an experimental tap confirmed his suspicion. The gameplay option was much more fruitful. Controls, normal skill activation, voice-activated HUD, off POV, first-person reticule, off, while a relatively short list, especially given the fact that it didn't include any of the normal mechanics or resolution options, which made sense as he was still in real life. It wasn't as if he'd been transported to a video game. This was just a quirk, an awesome quirk. He quickly flicked through the available options and then undid half of his choices immediately. He did not need to live his life inverted, where looking up suddenly meant he was looking down, although that wasn't nearly as bad as suddenly seeing the world in third person. Did his hair really look like that? But apart from those issues, the other choices were much more fruitful. His skills up 0 until that point had been voice activated, and while good for explaining why he had never accessed his quirk before, it wouldn't be all that great when fighting villains. If even one of them figured it out and covered his mouth, he'd be completely unable to fight back. Luckily, when he tapped the option, he was given 3 choices: voice activated, manual activation, and both. The moment he had switched off of voice activated, it had felt like a void inside him had been filled. In an instant, what could only be described as raw power flooded through his body and filled his entire being. He knew exactly what to do. He knew everything about how to use his quirk, the ins and outs immediately uploaded into his brain. Another feature of the game, Izuku murmured to himself. It was all so clear. Glancing back at the box in front of him, he switched off of manual and to both. It would be better to have every available option in the future, and with that in mind, switched the HUD to 1 as well. AHP and MP bar, as well as his name and level appearing in the corner of his vision, easily seen and monitored. He ignored the reticule option, which would just get annoying. With a thought and an extension of his new power, he closed the options box in front of him. That was much easier and much less conspicuous than physically tapping the close button. That would be an advantage, and he would need every advantage he could get if he wanted to be the greatest hero in the world. Maybe it was just a sudden rush of confidence, or maybe it was the information that had been recently downloaded into his brain. But for what may have been the first time in his life, Izuku actually believed that he could make it. He stood up and looked at the tree that still stood in front of him, though it slightly cracked from where he had punched it with all his force. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It had been 2 weeks since he had started seriously training to be a hero, and with less than 2 months before he had to go through the UA entrance exam, it was very unsettling, especially for the fact that he couldn't do anything even remotely impressive yet. As it stood, Izuku Midoriya, even with his new abilities, couldn't even be considered any more powerful than any other quirkless person. He had thought that he would have had to hide his quirk from his mother, or maybe there would have been effects that would be extremely visible to the people who he went to middle school with, but there was nothing had come from his training. It meant that he couldn't even go to register his quirk, as there was nothing about it he could visually show anyone else, but that he couldn't be physically damaged, although the pain still appeared, was an idea. But Izuku didn't really think that the registration office would appreciate someone stabbing themselves on the floor just to prove a point. Frankly, he was lost with what to do. Since the first day and excitement of his new abilities and skills, he hadn't been able to create any new skills. All he had were gamer's body, gamer's mind, and physical endurance. He had had 2 of those when he had started. Sure, with the training he had put himself through, his stats had gone up some, 2 points in strength, 1 in dexterity, and 1 in vitality. When those had increased, he hadn't felt much different, but unlike with the points in wisdom, the fact that he actually did felt and, in fact, see something happen was at least good news. Even with only the very little increase in strength and vitality change him, he had gone from being average on all points to ever so slightly ripped, with the hints of a 2-pack starting to form on his abdomen and the muscles along his arms and legs becoming a little more defined. Nothing that couldn't be achieved with regular training. But the fact that these changes had come about instantly when he got the points was the important part. In terms of stats, he now looked like this. Name: Izuku Midoriya. Level 5, 42, 04%. Title: The Gamer Race. Human quirk: Not applicable. HP: 101101 MP. 500 500 STR, 12 EIT, 10 DX, 13 INT, 34 WIS. 25 LUK. 2 points to spend. 0 Izuku Midoriya is a sad, shy child who dreams of being a hero. There is absolutely nothing special about him at all. In a world of superhumans, he is without power, but now, with the help of the gamer, he believes that he can achieve his dreams. Can he? Or is it just a pipe dream? Apart from the points he'd earned and his HP, everything else had stayed the same. He had figured out a few things about his quirk from experimentation and the information that had been downloaded into his brain, such as the fact that some of his stats affected his quirk as well as his physical body and mind, while strength and dexterity would make him stronger, more flexible, and more agile. Vitality, another physical stat, as well as increasing his stamina and overall health, would also increase his HP points. although the fact he had only gone up by 1 meant that he couldn't tell by how much. At this point, it was either 1 point of HP or 1% of the total. Unfortunately, there hadn't been a wisdom point to confirm it for him. Vitality would also increase his HP regeneration rate in tandem, although at that moment, it was only about 5/HP PM or 5 health points per minute, which, given the amount of risk heroes faced every day and the danger villains represented, was definitely not as high as it would need to be, especially considering the fact he only had 101 points of health. It was harrowing to know how easily he could die. Hell, even just punching a tree took out 5 points. Other stats that affected his quirk were intelligence and wisdom. He knew that when he got a point in intelligence, it would improve his memory retention and speed of thought, but it would also increase the maximum amount of mana. Whereas wisdom would increase his ability to use the knowledge he had instead of just being able to spew out cold facts and logic. It would also increase his MP regeneration speed, something which at that moment was rather slow at the rate of 1/MPPM or 1 mana point per minute. Mana was another point of frustration for Izuku. Skills were one thing that could be voice activated, ignoring the fact that he didn't actually have any active skills that could be voice activated. It still meant that when he got them, he'd be able to use them no matter what. But mana was, for all intents and purposes, magic, and magic didn't exist. He had no idea how to use it, and it wasn't exactly like he could pick up a book and learn how to do so. It would definitely be a useful thing if it actually acted in any way similar to magic, but for now he had no way to access it. That is, if it could even be accessed, he was starting to think that it was just there to complete the look of his quirk. And wasn't that a depressing thought? Almost as depressing as the fact his EXP hadn't gone up a single percent. Line another 2 weeks, and another set of disappointments. Even with his steady training regimen, Izuku had still barely gotten any increases at all. 2 more points in strength, 3 in dexterity, another in vitality, and 1 in intelligence for deciding to build and use a rudimentary obstacle course. Any increase at all was good, but this was going too slowly. The entrance exams were only 1 month away. He would definitely fail at this rate, and there seemed to be nothing he could do. Fortunately, the point in intelligence let him know that the increase in HP and MP went up 1% with every point increase. He now had 102 HP and 505 MP, and given that it didn't say 102.01 HP told Izuku that it only showed the whole number. Good to know. The urgency of the situation definitely wasn't lost on him, and he had decided to take a different direction. That morning, while walking to his usual training area, he had noticed a new bookstore on the street. It was a quaint little wooden one that practically screamed nature, and the amount of customers moving around inside proved its popularity. As he had been about to move on, Izuku remembered the thought he had 2 weeks back about picking up a book and reading about how to learn magic. The point obviously still stood. No matter how well the bookstore would have fit into a fantasy, there weren't going to be any real books on magic in there. Probably a few bullshit ones, though. The fact was, though, there were things he could learn from books, the best ways to train, the science behind, and the most common quirks. Things that would undoubtedly be invaluable in the future, and finally, and most importantly, martial arts. Even with the inclusion of quirks, any good hero still needed to know how to fight. In fact, martial arts was some heroes' only line of defense, as their quirks were supplemental to them, rather than any source of attacks. Heroes like Erasure had stuck out. His quirk, while powerful as it let him turn off the quirks of others, would only allow that for them to be unable to use their quirks. And while devastating to nearly all villains, it didn't stop them from picking up a weapon and running at him, or just attempting to hurt his with their fists alone. Martial arts and knowing how to fight were integral for his hero work. And since Izuku still hadn't developed anything really useful, they'd be just as important to him. He decided to visit the shop that night after his training. Unfortunately, things don't always go to plan. Izuku panted, his breath ragged and strained as he sprinted across the forest and into town, deftly dodging obstacles and barely avoiding knocking himself out on a low-hanging tree branch. His training had run on longer than he had realized, and it was only a few minutes until 8 o'clock, the time that all but a few stores closed in town, although it being a bookstore might have meant that it closed even earlier than that. As he entered the edge of town and his lungs started to burn, Izuku considered that he could always wait until tomorrow to get the books before immediately shaking himself of those thoughts. It had already been a month with no progress. He had no time to waste. He careened around the corner to the high street, disturbing the few people still walking around that part of town, and thanked any god that he could that his ability would take away the pain in his lungs and legs soon after he stopped running. Finally, he made to the front of the shop. Ping! Izuku ignored the noise. It was probably just another point in vitality, good, but not important right now. He leaned forward and rested his hands on his knees, breathing heavily. After a few minutes of breathing and waiting for the pain to leave, he finally chanced to look at his watch. 7:30. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. He had made it in time. Finally relaxing, he looked towards the box in front of him to make sure which stat it was and close it. New skill created. Sprint. Passive/active. Level 2. 3.02%. By running great distances and pushing your body to the absolute limit you've found that you can move extremely quickly. Passively increases base speed. Active use will give speed increase of 35% until stopped. You've got to be kidding me. Izuku stared, blank-faced at the message in front of him. A month. A month of trying to improve himself, and he does it by accident. What the hell had he been training all this time for then? Pinching the bridge of his nose and closing the box, Izuku sighed and walked towards the shop. At least now he had a skill he could actually train, and with the books on martial arts, hopefully that would make him good enough for the exam. He pushed the door in. It didn't move. He looked to the window at the side. Opening times 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. every day, just as luck, his terrible, terrible 2 points of luck. He sighed and turned around, leaning his back against the door. At least today wasn't completely wasted. I got a new skill. Why are you leaning on my shop? The woman's voice was sudden and unexpected. He hadn't heard anyone walking up. Izuku jumped away from the door and turned towards location of the voice. I'm sorry, I just wanted to buy a book, but you were closed and I ran really far and dash. A giggle cut of his rambling apologies. It's all right. I was watching you trying to catch your breath. She giggled again. From the speed you got here, I thought you were late to a meeting or something. As she spoke, Izuku finally managed to get a good look at the apparent bookstore owner. Even in the dying light of the day, it was easy to see that she was appealing. She had long black hair and a princess cut running down the majority of her back, and pale white skin that contrasted amazingly. Every feature of her face was equal parts soft and aristocratic, and all her features were emphasized by her gleaming purple eyes. To finish off her look, she wore an obviously expensive red and gold kimono, despite there being no festival on. Izuku thought she might just be the most appealing woman he had ever seen, and as such, couldn't help but let out a soft exclamation. Wow, another giggle, thank you. Her appealing eyes turned upwards as a smile entered her features. Izuku's face filled with BLD as he blushed a bright red. He didn't think that she would be able to hear him. He remembered why he was there and quickly forced himself to calm down. Ma'am, he started before she cut him off once again. Terra. She smiled again, and Izuku's blush returned as quickly as it had gone. Terra, I came here to buy some books from your store. He hesitated. Could you please let me buy them now? He bowed at the waist to hopefully get his point across. You came to buy books. Yes, that's right. Izuku nodded. Terra stood in front of him and glanced at the store and back. How about this? You tell me why you were in such a hurry, and I'll decide whether or not it's worth it. That sound fair? Izuku let out a sigh of relief. Thank you so much. You don't know how much this means to me. After a brief moment on the street waiting for Terra to unlock the door to her shop, she had led him inside, through a door at the back, and told him to sit at a small table in what looked to be a kitchen. Izuku figured then that this was probably her house, and suddenly felt quite uncomfortable, not only at being invited into someone else's home when he only really wanted to buy some books, but also the fact that said person was a girl, a very attractive girl. He was roused out of his thoughts suddenly by the sound of a cup being placed in front of him. Tea, he noticed, in a plate of rice crackers on the center of the table. Terra sat down opposite him and took a sip of her own cup before picking up one of the crackers. It's not going to bit, you know, she said with a smile. Nodding towards the untouched tea in front of him, Izuku mumbled, wondering why now of all times that his gamer's mind wasn't preventing his discomfort. Unless, of course, it only activated in times of high emotion or stress, or that it only took away wholly negative experiences. He had, after all, experienced a litany of joyous emotions while attempting to train his new quirk, just from the fact that he had some sort of ability. Or maybe it was... Terra giggled, cutting off his thoughts mid-sentence. "You're mumbling," Izuku said, embarrassed. Yet another emotion that his ability didn't seem to counteract. "Sorry about that. I tend to speak to myself. Oh, it's quite all right. I do it too. I feel it helps center the mind, don't you?" Izuku trailed off into an uncomfortable silence. Terra, however, either didn't notice his emotional state or didn't care, simply staring at him with a soft smile of her face, calmly sipping tea. Izuku attempted to take a sip of his own tea, only to result in a mouthful of scalding liquid when he tipped the cup back a little too fast. "So," Terra finally spoke up after Izuku had a small coughing fit. "Books. Oh yes, right." Her smile stretched. "I've never seen anyone quite as enthusiastic about books as you seem to be. Would you care to enlighten me as to why they're so important to you?" Izuku let out an uncomfortable cough into his fist and turned his head away from her, cheeks burning red. Perhaps he had been a little overzealous in his excitement. "I won't judge. I'm quite the fan of them, too." She giggled and gestured to the door to the front of the shop. "Clearly, I need them to be a hero." He finally managed to say a hero. "How would some dusty old books help you there?" Well, that is, I want to learn how to fight." She frowned. "To fight? I would have thought with wanting to be a hero, you would already know how to do that. Aren't there quirk trainers for that kind of thing?" Izuku cringed at the words. While he hadn't had a quirk until recently, he could have definitely done more, exercised, gone on a high-protein diet, learned martial arts, or even attempted to before now. He decided to go with the least embarrassing answer. "I couldn't use my quirk until recently." She rose a delicate eyebrow. "I thought quirks finished manifesting at age." She seemed to search for the information. 8. Was it? 6. Izuku immediately corrected, having memorized that number when he was a child. "Right," she agreed. "So what do you mean?" "Well," Izuku had prepared for this question, "I've always had it, but I didn't know I had it. I thought I was quirkless, really." "What does it do? If you don't mind me asking." "No, it's all right." He waved off her concern. "It's a healing quirk, the easy explanation, and relatively close to the truth, or at least part of it. With his gamer's body ability. Healing. I would have thought that would be something easy to notice." Izuku rubbed the back of his neck and let out a weak chuckle, averting his eyes from her face. It really did feel bad to lie to her like this, but was necessary until he could actually figure out what the hell was going on, or what his quirk really did. And though she was nice, Terra was still a stranger. He didn't really feel the need to spill his heart to her. So he stuck to his pre-prepared story. "I guess I just didn't get hurt enough to notice." She stared at him for a moment, as if she was confused about something, before finally shrugging. "Fair enough." She took another sip of tea. "So how would books help you with a quirk like that?" "Oh, well, I'm not looking for books on quirks. I need martial arts books." "You said this was to help you become a hero, yes?" she asked. "Yeah," he confirmed. "Then wouldn't a teacher be better?" "That would work better than any book." He let out a nervous chuckle. "I don't really have much time." "What do you mean?" "I'm taking the entrance exam in 2 weeks." If Izuku had been looking at her, instead of suddenly finding the walls more interesting, he would have seen Terra's eyes widening in shock as she slowly put down her cup. 2 weeks. That seems a little short. If you're only looking for training now." She paused, and for the first time in the conversation, shifted uncomfortably. "Do you really think you can do it?" The disbelief in her voice drew Izuku's attention back from the interesting walls. "Honestly." He let out a sigh and ran his hand through his hair. "No. I don't." "Then why dash?" She started before Izuku cut her off. "Because I have to. This is my chance. This is my only chance. I wanted to be a hero ever since I was a child, and I thought I'd never get that chance. Even without a quirk, I signed up for the exams." He paused and let out a heaving breath. I have to try. It's all I've ever wanted." By the end of the speech, his words were no longer unsteady, but resolute in his determination, in his cause. "I see. was all Tara said before she stood up and walked further back in her home. Izuku wondered for a moment if she had gone to get more tea, before she quickly returned to the room and placed a pile of books in front of him. The designs ranging from thick tomes to what looked like school textbooks to something that seemed to be an instructional pamphlet. "You're lucky you know." The smile was back on her face. "I am," Izuku questioned. "I was going to throw these out. It's actually quite the coincidence that you turned up wanting these really." "Absolutely. These are the books you wanted, yes." Izuku looked down at the books properly this time and noticed that the cover of the first was quite obviously a textbook for martial arts, karate, in fact. He picked it up to get a better look at the thinner book underneath, only to be immediately shocked into a stupor at the message that appeared in front of him with a ping. "You have picked up a skill book. Skill book, beginner's karate, would you like to learn?" Izuku couldn't help but stare at the box in front of him. What? This was something he could do. What exactly would it do? Why hadn't this happened to any of the other? He paused in his thought. Had he actually picked up a book in all this time? He decided all that none of these things were absolutely important at that very movement and pushed them away before placing down the karate textbook back on the pile and attempting not to flinch when the box in front of him suddenly disappeared, before refocusing on Tara, who was back sitting opposite him, giving him a strange look. Sorry about that. Are you back to Earth now? You looked a little out of it." "Sorry about that." He let out what he hoped was a disarming chuckle. "I was just lost in my thoughts, dreaming about what you'll do with all this." She giggled and gestured at the books in front of him. "Newfound power. Huh, something like that, yeah? So how much do I owe you? Is my company really so terrible you need to leave immediately?" Tara pouted at him. Izuku lurched back. No. I didn't mean dash." His backtracking was quickly cut off, but yet another of Tara's melodious giggles. "Don't worry about it. I know young boys like you can't sit still for too long." She glanced at an ornate clock hanging on the wall to the side. "And I suppose it is getting rather late. Dash. Don't worry about the cost. This conversation has been plenty." She bit into a cracker. Izuku blinked. "Are you sure? I can pay. I have money with Dash." He patted his empty pocket in surprise before desperately searching his parson for the missing wallet. He had left it at home. He hung his head in shame. "I suppose it's a good thing I don't want payment, then." The amusement was as obvious in her voice as it was through the outright grin on her face. After a few more minutes of talking, Tara bid Izuku goodbye. He left her shop and quickly put the books into his inventory before activating his new sprint ability and running home in an attempt to get there before it got too dark. There was no need to worry his mother. After all, he wasn't doing anything dangerous. Back in the shop, Tara sat with her eyes closed at the kitchen table where she had just shared an interesting conversation with Izuku. After a moment, she opened her eyes again before slowly standing up and waving her hand over the table. With the wave, the almost empty plate of crackers, which only she had eaten, much to her amusement, and the 2 empty teacups vanished without a trace, and Tara herself made her way up the stairs at the back of the room, paying no mind to the disappearing crockery. She smiled to herself and spoke softly. She had noticed the way his eyes flicked back and forth when he picked up the book and the flinch when he had put it down. When she had sensed him outside her shop, she wasn't sure. But now, she was certain. The gamer has returned. Izuku had been staring at the books in front of him for the past hour since his mother had gone to bed, partly to make sure that she was asleep, and partly because he wasn't entirely sure he had processed what their existence meant. Every single time he had picked up one of the books, aside from the pamphlet on meditation, a box would appear in front of him asking if he would like to activate the skill book. Case in point, the message that was currently floating in front of him as a result of his picking up the basic karate book. "You have picked up a skill book. Skill book, beginner's karate, would you like to learn?" He had been training as hard as he could for almost 2 months straight. There were 2 weeks until the terrifying entrance exam, and he had barely increased his stats at all, let alone learn any amount of new skills. Sprint was great and all, and would definitely come in useful at higher levels, especially when coupled with his gamer's body. But he needed something strong, and he needed it fast. He would never be able to get sprint high to use it for active battling. Beyond that, he had only and accidentally gained the physical endurance skill, which would, again, be incredible at higher levels. But Izuku just didn't have the time to achieve that. And although he should have had the idea of books or even internet instructions to learn useful fighting skills that would hopefully amplify his quirk use and work with his slowly increasing stat points earlier. This was more than he would have ever hoped for. Skill books and games allowed the player to instantly learn new abilities instead of working up to them through skill trees. In a lot of cases, they allowed the player to learn skills that they normally couldn't in the first place. A wizard would suddenly be able to fight with a sword with the right book and vice versa for the knight. Izuku prayed to any god that was listening that his powers worked the same. There was only one way to find out. Slowly and with as much hesitation as he could afford, Izuku reached his hand out to the box and pressed the accept button. Izuku would never admit that he made any noise at all, let alone a distinctly unmanly yelp, as the book in his hand suddenly transformed into hundreds of brightly glowing yellow motes of light that surged directly into his forehead. The headache came hard and fast, but luckily it also went away just as fast. He didn't even manage to get his hands clutched around his head before the pain had gone. But a headache wasn't the only thing that the light had given him. Knowledge flooded his mind. Perfect comprehension and understanding flowed through his mind at an incredible rate. Everything that had been in the book was now in him, not just instructions, but how to do it, how one move twisted into the next. Everything new skill learned. Beginner karate, active, level 1. 0.00%. Fighting is useful for so many situations, but brawling just isn't your style. You need a more civilized way. With every level, your ability to use karate will increase. Holy SHD was the only thing Izuku could say. This wasn't just good. This was the greatest ability that anyone could ever have ever. To be able to instantly learn anything from any book. He leapt up from his chair and almost ran to the open area in his room and quickly started going through as many poses and attacks as he could. This wasn't just like reading instructions. This was better than anything. The knowledge was in his mind and the movements were already in his muscles, as if he had spent years actually learning and practicing karate. He flowed from one form to the next, textbook pose to textbook pose, punch to kick to roundhouse. Ping beginner karate. Active, level 5, 76.02%. Fighting is useful for so many situations, but brawling just isn't your style. You need a more civilized way. With every level, your ability to use karate will increase. That was quick. That was really quick, but he didn't feel any different at all. Dismissing the box in front of him, he placed his hand on his chin in his traditional thinking pose. The skill had stated that as he went up in levels, he would go up in use and, logically, power. But he didn't feel different at all. On his frantic run home, he had managed to level up sprint a third time, and the difference was immediately obvious. He could feel it. But these level ups, as quick as they had been, hadn't changed anything. In fact, his movements hadn't changed at all. No more speed, no more power. That was strange. But this was also the first skill he had learned from the books instead of creating himself. Perhaps, he thought, glancing at the rest of the books in front of him, perhaps these skills worked differently. The knowledge and ability had instantly downloaded into his body as if he were in the Matrix. And he was definitely picking up a book on Kung Fu as soon as he could. It was likely that these skills worked differently. It was possible that the full ability, or at least that which the book contained, and however many levels that translated to were instantly loaded up into him, and the skill only started at level 1 because that's where all skills started. Ping Izuku was shocked out of his thoughts by the now familiar noise of his powering up. Wisdom +1, huh? He couldn't help but let out a laugh at that. Was that going to happen every time he thought of something smart? At least it was a definite confirmation that his thoughts were correct. Izuku sighed and sank deeply into his chair. This was incredible. He could almost feel his dreams coming to fruition. With these books, even just 2 weeks was plenty of time to get into fighting shape. He hoped. Line Izuku let out a deep breath and sank in the grass where he sat. If he was still capable of sweating, something he hadn't done since his gamer's body first came into play, then he would have wiped it from his brow. 1 day to go. 1 day until the exam. 1 week until he could start his heroic journey. 1 day until he could show the world what he was made of. And DMN, if it didn't look like things were going good. After another 2 weeks of training since Terra had given him his miracle, he had finally made progress, incredible progress. Name: Izuku Midoriya, level 5, 42, 04%. Title: The Gamer Race. Human quirk: not applicable. HP: 103103 MP, 505505 STR, 22 VIT, 16 DX, 18 INT, 35 WIS, 27 LUK. 4 points to spend. 0. Izuku Midoriya is a sad, shy child who dreams of being a hero. There is absolutely nothing special about him at all. In a world of superhumans, he is without power, but now, with the help of the gamer, he believes that he can achieve his dreams. Can he? Or is it just a pipe dream? The description hadn't changed at all, but that wasn't a massive concern. Izuku hadn't yet done anything that he could think would influence it too much. No, what Izuku was really focused on were his status points. All his training had come to use, as every single one of his stats, apart from intelligence, had increased by a significant margin. His strength had even gone up by 8 points. And the differences were immediately apparent. Even if he didn't have a list of the changes floating in front of him, he still would have been able to tell what had changed. Everything physical had become easier. His body was more flexible and better balanced, his movements more graceful, and his strength was almost twice what it was before his powers activated. His body had changed and looked too. The muscles which had suddenly, but barely, appeared when had first started his training were now obviously pronounced against his body. A fully formed six-pack and much harder than normal arms and legs. Still nothing superhuman, but definitely heading towards the upper levels of quirkless human performance. His first 2 months of training had produced nothing like this. Partly because he didn't really know what he was doing, and partly because he didn't have any skills at that time. Skills, he had found, were invaluable to his progress. Using them in conjunction with his regular training, apart from making it incredibly fun, allowed him to do more taxing and strenuous exercises, which allowed him to improve quicker both his regular statistics and the levels for all of his skills. As it turned out, he had been correct about the base levels of skills contained in skill books. His beginner's karate had tapered off its incredible increases at level 45 before increasing normally for 2 more levels. The other 3 books had produced similar results. Acrobatics had stopped quick leveling at level 15, as did parkour, but the book titled How to Be a Ninja, which had produced the skill ninjutsu, had stopped at level 3, despite Izuku thinking that the knowledge in the book was quite comprehensive. How to crouch, techniques for sticking to the shadows, that kind of thing, everything you would expect out of a book about being a ninja. Izuku assumed that the low level meant that there was apparently far more to know about the art. Things that had also developed were skill subsets, specialized skills that fell under the same title, but could be improved independently. None of the books he had used gave him any of these skills. Again, he could only assume it was either because all the how-to in those books counted as one improvable skill, or because there just wasn't anything specialized enough to warrant an extra sub-skill. In fact, the only sub-skill that he did currently have was Silent Step, and it was listed under ninjutsu. It had come about when he had initially disappointed by the lack of actual ninja skills and the low level that the ability had stopped at. Ninjas could walk silently, Izuku had thought, and so without much expectation he had childishly attempted to do as such, when, with the customary ping, a box had appeared in front of him, proclaiming his creation of the Silent Step under the ninjutsu tab. In fact, the only thing that hadn't brought him any advancement was the pamphlet that Terra had included with the 4 textbooks, the one on meditation. Izuku leaned back into the rock he was sitting up against and frowned. He had flicked through the pamphlet, and just like the textbooks, it was a how-to manual. Something else he had discovered: any book that didn't include any instructions and just the theory didn't count as a skill book. He had gone through practically every piece of literature in his room and had found nothing that worked, so he didn't know why it didn't work. Perhaps because it wasn't an actual book and so didn't count as a skill book. Izuku didn't know, but he definitely needed to find out if he wanted to really understand his quirk. He opened his inventory and pulled the pamphlet out. It was simple in design, just like any other. It was green and blue and held about 3 pages of information. A very simple but still quite comprehensive how to guide. There was no reason that it shouldn't be able to be absorbed like the others. He flicked through it again and couldn't help but frown once more. It was very frustrating to be faced with such an annoying problem with his abilities so early on. He would have thought that he'd be able to handle it. But he had all the information, and there was nothing that he could see that would cause. A piece of paper fell out and landed on the grass. Ping! Immediately a box floated in front of him. You have picked up a skill book. Skill book. Meditation would you like to learn? Izuku stared at the message for a moment, before blinking rapidly and pressing the yes button. Like the others, the pamphlet dissolved into motes of light and rushed into his head. After a few seconds, the headache was gone and the information was safely stored in his body. New skill learned. Meditation, active, level 1. 0.00%. You don't want to fall asleep on the job, so instead you'll meditate. So peaceful and relaxing, it's just a thing to refresh a tired body. Active use of meditation will give 10% HP and MP regeneration increase. Well, Izuku said, that explains it. There was a piece of paper stuck to the inside of the pamphlet which prevented him from absorbing it, as just holding it counted as two things at once. He let out a short laugh. That had been annoying him for a week, but it was just a piece of paper. With that, he picked up the paper that was, thankfully, still lying in front of him. Ping! Another box appeared. You have picked up a skill book. Skill book. Chi manipulation would you like to learn? What? And the confusion was suddenly back. Chi, isn't that stuff monks use? Izuku would freely admit that he didn't know anything about it. His entire young life had been consumed with researching heroes and quirks, and while there wasn't anything he didn't know about them, there was plenty he didn't know about anything else. He refocused on the small slip of paper in his hand rather than the box in front of him. What was even stranger than the skill he could now apparently learn was the fact that the paper he was looking at wasn't big enough for any kind of writing, let alone any kind of instructions. On the paper wasn't a comprehensive step-by-step on manipulating chi, but in fact a bunch of incomprehensible lines crisscrossing across the paper. The lines themselves were even smaller and more bunched up around the edges and corners, suggesting that whatever this was also too small for the paper it was drawn on. Did Terra make this? It was stuck inside one of the things she had given him. Did she intend for him to get this, or? No, Izuku shook his head resolutely. Terra had been going to throw these things out, and this piece of paper had just been stuck on one of the pages of the pamphlet. Hell, Izuku hadn't even known it was there until 2 weeks later. Izuku stared at the box, still floating in front of him, seeing as he hadn't yet let go on the paper. This wasn't like any of his other skills, and the U exam was tomorrow. He should really focus on his current skills and getting them as high as possible before then. But Izuku considered all the skills I currently have stopped quick leveling. Since this is a skill book, this should have the same effect, right? It had taken him 2 weeks to get to the peak of his skill book ability with his beginner's karate. Who knows how long this one would take? But then again, every little helps. Finally making up his mind, Izuku nodded to himself and pressed accept. The world exploded. The light entered him in the usual way, but suddenly something was different. The headache, which was always manageable, was suddenly excruciating. Shots of agony hammering into his mind from every angle. It felt as if his brain was being perpetually inflated and then forcefully compressed, over and over and over again. But the pain didn't stop there. Through his body, liquid fire forced and crawled down every limb. Down through his face and to the tips of his toes it pulsed and struggled against the walls of his veins. Every movement refocusing the pain to another part of his body. And then, just as suddenly as his headaches, the pain was gone. Izuku let out a heaving gasp and fell to his knees. When he stood up, his breath came out rasping and hard. If he could still bleed, Izuku had no doubt he would be tasting it now. The pain was gone, and not even a phantom remained, but still his fingers twitched at the recent memory. What he managed to gasp out, the F was that. Izuku felt quite justified in swearing at the moment. Why was that so different from all the other skill books? After several moments of heavy breathing, he finally managed to get his racing mind and body under control again and pulled himself off his knees to rest, once again, against the large rock behind him. 3 separate boxes floated in front of him. New skill learned. Chi manipulation. Passive/active. Level 1. 0.00%. Chi is a fundamental force of life. Through perseverance or teachings, you have learned how to HRNSS and manipulate it. Due to the gamer's unique use of the multi-purpose mana, your mana will be used instead and transformed into the Chi upon use. This allows you to use multiple forms of energy from the same store with no ill effect. Gamer's body reconfiguration. Energy pathways activated. Warning, you will experience some pain. Please brace yourself. Access to mana granted. Basic unique gamer abilities unlocked. New skill created. Mana manipulation. Passive/active. Level 1. 0.00%. Mana is a unique multi-purpose energy available only to the gamer. Mana can be manipulated directly to create basic or complex attacks, depending on your level and understand on what you want to do. Mana is also able to transform into any other type of available energy without ill effect as long as the user is capable. Now that deserved a fainting. Unfortunately, Izuku was the gamer, and gamer's mind didn't allow that to happen, so instead he could only stare at the 3 messages, especially the middle one, as it would have been useful to know before the fact, rather than after the agonizing event was already over. Please brace yourself. Izuku's eyebrow twitched. Somebody was definitely mocking him. Line, and you're sure that it's back? Tara rolled her eyes at the figure on the monitor in front of her. Yes, I'm sure. The figure shifted. How did you find out? Other people can't see his notifications. Tara let out a short giggle and rested her chin on her hand. I gave him a little present. What? Why would you dash? The figure managed. It wouldn't do for him to be unable to defend himself. He wants to be a hero, you know, really. Well, at least that bodes well for. Hang on, was he quirkless before this? Tara nodded, and the figure continued SHD. Then he's gonna dash, don't worry, Tara said, shaking her head. He won't be revealing anything. I've already orchestrated that. He's a smart kid. He'll pick up on it. The figure was silent for a moment. And you're absolutely sure? Tara laughed again. You don't trust me. The figure coughed into her hand. Sorry. It's just, this is going to change the world. Quirks were interesting things. Interesting, powerful, and very, very dangerous. When quirks first came about, only about 5% of the entire population of the world could use them. The first generation of quirk users. Of course, with a small amount of the population suddenly acquiring incredible abilities that they could use to easily hurt others, the rest of the population got scared and immediately threw up protests, and some even attacked the quirked individuals, eventually forcing the majority of them into doing what the normal population feared in the first place. It was only now, over a century later, that there was any real peace. But that didn't mean that there weren't any great issues that had to be tackled in all that time. Most important of them all was considered by most to be the quirk registration system. When it was first suggested, the backlash from many people, quirk users or not, was clear and obvious. A system of registering people to a government was, for obvious reasons, not widely accepted. However, in time, as more and more people gained quirks, including those in positions of power, incidents caused by superpowered people rose dramatically. Murder, RPE, robbery, wide-scale destruction in every country in the world. And so the registration was finally pushed through, as people treated it more as a list of weaponry than a list of people. The rest of the quirk-based laws soon followed, which lead to the world Izuku lived in. It also, unfortunately, led to the situation he currently found himself in, which was aimlessly staring at the quirk registration form in front of him, his fingers hovering unsurely over his keyboard. It was required by law that when you attained your quirk, you, or your parents in basically every case, you had to register it within a year, otherwise you, or your parents, would face an extremely large fine, something neither he nor his mother had the capability of paying. Izuku had had his abilities for just less than 2 months now, and with the UA exam starting later that afternoon. And if that wasn't incredibly nerve-wracking, he didn't know what was, and so he had to finally register his quirk, not that he hadn't been attempting to do so for the past 3 hours. Honestly, he had been putting this moment off for as long as he could. His abilities were confusing, varied, and for the most part, had not parts that he could effectively demonstrate. They also didn't fit a standard scientific theme like every other quirk in existence. That they didn't fit a scientific premise was Izuku's biggest issue. His abilities, because he just couldn't bring himself to call them a quirk anymore. Every quirk in existence was based in science, no matter how crazy or unusual they first seemed. Even if the creation and first existence of the quirks themselves could barely be explained despite the decades of research, which meant that his powers were an issue, because they were completely unique, and while having powerful and unique abilities looked good on the surface and would definitely have excited his younger self beyond measure, it was also something that made people targets. Over the course of quirk history, there was, and would always be people who looked and used at them for primarily evil purposes, some villains, some scientists, and some God knows what. And people with unique quirks were often hunted for. Well, Izuku didn't actually know. But people went missing all the time, and it was only a very small amount of time before heroes or the police ever turned up anything. But there was always one common trend: experimentation. The missing people always turned up dead, cut up, and dissected. There's an incident that shook the world just over 50 years before Izuku was born. 218 missing people found, all dead, all experimented on in some weird underground lab. Now, this information wasn't exactly thought upon by most of the general populace, no matter how incredible the quirk, because these disappearances were so rare. The 200 missing people had been reported over the course of a decade, after all. It was considered a one-time event. But Izuku had been researching and obsessing over quirks since the time he could read. They were his whole life, and so he was far more knowledgeable about these events than most others. Apart from the police and heroes involved, of course, Izuku was also the type of person to be just a little paranoid about these kinds of things, especially because, as stated before, his queer abilities were completely unique. He would be an absolute goldmine to any messed-up scientist that wanted to dissect him, he assumed. Even with all this knowledge and his intrinsic nervous personality, which had thankfully calmed down a lot since his gamer's mind came into effect, Izuku would have been thinking of these kind of things if it weren't for the fact that a similar incident had happened in his town just last week. The person had been reported missing 2 weeks ago and had been found on the day before this one, brutally cut up and lying alone in a recently abandoned lab. The police had concluded that it was one and the same with the other usual incidents, and that the perpetrator had left long before the police managed to find the place. That person had only had a teleportation quirk, a rare quirk, but still a quirk nonetheless. This all meant that someone in his town was capable of such horror, and that they could be looking for new people to take too. Just being a late bloomer would put enough attention onto Izuku, but having the abilities he did, he would definitely be a target. So what could he do about it? He could lie. He could lie until he was either strong enough to protect himself or known publicly enough that his disappearance would be immediately recognized and investigated. Becoming a hero at you would solve both of these issues in time. But until then, he needed to register something, and he needed to do it as soon as he could. Izuku's fingers hovered over the keys. He couldn't just outright lie, not only because that would be dishonest and his mother had raised him well, but also because he would actually need to be able to exhibit his abilities to anyone in authority that asked. The teachers at you, a might, and they would obviously need to know his abilities to help him learn how to be a hero. So here he was stuck in this predicament: what abilities to choose. He had to invent a quirk that would allow him to use his best abilities publicly, but would also not draw too much attention to him. Unfortunately, this immediately threw his inventory out the window. Space/time quirks, or rather, space quirks, since no one had ever exhibited a time-based ability, were extremely rare and often held by the missing people. Fortunately, the boxes he could see and interact with were invisible to other people. He had accidentally pulled them up once at dinner and started freaking out about what to say until he had noticed that his mother hadn't reacted at all. So he could still use his inventory and look through his status and menus, and such as long as he was discreet. The rest of his abilities were all physical. In fact, most were simply normal skills that anyone could learn. The only exceptions being his gamer's mind, gamer's body, and his chi manipulation. He hadn't even started on his mana. There was no time to improve anything discernibly before his exam. Again, fortunately, his chi was invisible and also internal. It basically mimicked a strength enhancement quirk. Although, he admitted, he hadn't exactly gotten far with it, as the quick leveling had bottomed out at level 5, which was still annoyingly higher than his ninjutsu skill. Of course, he couldn't just put down strength enhancement, because that would leave open questions as to why he couldn't take damage. Strength didn't directly mean durability after all. So, all in all, he would have to go with his first choice, something he had arbitrarily stated to Tara when she had asked, that he had a healing quirk. It would explain his not taking damage as healing really fast. It was common enough to not draw any undue attention, as long as he was vague enough in the description of the apparent speed of his healing, and it would serve as an explanation as to his not noticing it before, as it was completely passive. Well, it was until he discovered it, and found that he could speed up the healing in parts of his body to increase his strength. Izuku couldn't help but chuckle. It was perfect. Quickly tapping into few required details and a vague description of what it could do, which basically amounted to healing and overhealing. Izuku had finally finished the form apart from the name. Most people had quirks that others already had. Their parents or family, for instance, were likely to have the same or extremely similar quirks. It was most often, in fact, that a parent would directly pass their quirk down to their child, rather than them getting a combination of their parents' quirks, like his childhood friend, Kakin, which meant that those people could simply search the open list of quirks for the one matching their description and click that, automatically giving them the name. Izuku, however, already knew that no healing quirk that currently existed matched the description he had already given. And again, the teachers at U would clearly recognize this immediately. They were the best in the world, after all, which meant that he definitely couldn't lie. And while this was a bit worrying for someone who wanted to stay completely off the radar, new quirks were being found and named every day. So it was only with the smallest amount of worry that Izuku allowed himself to giggle hysterically at the prospect of naming his own quirk. And so, with barely restrained glee, Izuku typed in the coolest thing he could think of and sent the form off. Static body, the perfect descriptor for his exhibited abilities, a body that wouldn't atrophy and appeared to take no damage at all, staying the same no matter what. It was brilliant. Of course, this was nowhere close to how he had explained it on the form, and the name would only really make sense to him and anyone that directly saw him in action. But still, it was the thought that counted. With that arduous task completed, Izuku decided to take a shower and change into his school uniform, ready for the U.A. exam. It wouldn't do to be anything less than fully prepared. And on that note, he quickly made sure that he had, in fact, stored his tracksuit in his inventory the previous night and hadn't just imagined it. Line U was grand. It was magnificent. It was the center of learning for the greatest heroes in the world. It was H-shaped. The entire building was shaped like the letter H, with 4 towers and 4 interconnecting hallways. Izuku couldn't help but stare at it, partly in awe at the incredibly institution he stood in front of, and partly in disbelief of the design choices which he probably definitely would have made himself, if given the chance. Nothing could stop him now. This was his moment, the start of his journey, his avenue to greatness, to being the greatest hero in the world. Izuku took his first step forwards, passing over a crack in the ground that might have tripped him up a few months earlier, if it weren't for his greatly improved body. He quickly moved onwards and into the directed hall, where he would sit with his fellow future heroes. Line, everybody say he. President Mike, the hero leading the introductory lecture to the exam, shouted out. The room of almost 1,000 participating teens responded with complete silence. And President Mike grinned. You're all so serious, he enthusiastically continued, despite the less than stellar reaction to his introduction. Izuku couldn't believe it. Frankly, President Mike, the pro-hero and radio star, was leading the lecture. Izuku had to clap a hand over his mouth to stop himself from shouting out when he immediately noticed nobody else had. He did it whenever the hero shouted it over the radio, after all. He decided to keep the hand there, just in case. The hero continued. I'm going to give you all the lowdown on this test. You all ready? Again, nobody responded, but the hero continued unruffled. Now, pay attention, my fantastic listeners, cause I'm only going to say this once. He held up a finger for emphasis. We're going to test you all by running you, though, a 10-minute fighting exercise in our super rad replica city. The previously silent crowd shifted and started muttering at this proclamation. A fighting exercise. How would that work, Izuku thought. Luckily, his answer was immediately answered. We got a large number of villains littered around our fancy battlefield. There'll be 3 different types. An informatic appeared on the giant screen behind him, showing a cartoonishly drawn city and shadows of 3 different figures off to the side, each denoted with a number, 1 to 3. They'll appear in 3 different types. The bigger and badder ones given the most, the smaller, weaker ones given the least. You got it. Using your quirks, you got to take down as many villains as you can and get as many points as you can. He pulled back from the lectern, but don't think about attacking any of your fellow competitors, because that ain't hero-like at all, and you'll be disqualified. He stuck his tongue out and shot them all a thumbs down. President Mike then opened his mouth to continue his, in Izuku's opinion, incredible lecture before another voice interrupted him. Excuse me, may I ask a question? The voice came from a few rows behind Izuku from a very strict and intimidating-looking teen wearing glasses and a uniform he didn't recognize. The teen pulled up the handout they had all been given before the lecture and pointed at it as dramatically as possible. On the handout here, it clearly states that there are 4 types of villains to fight. Izuku blinked. He hadn't even ready the thing yet, and he had arrived early. How had this teen done it? Such an incredible error, the teen continued, would be of the highest embarrassment to a top-tier establishment like Yui. The reason we're here today is to learn to be heroes, and I would like to know if this is a mistake or not. President Mike let out a hearty chuckle. Rest assured, examinee 7111. There is no mistake. You'll all be fastened a 4th typo villain. Although he chuckled again, maybe it'd be better to call it an unstoppable wall instead. With that, he gestured again, wildly to the screen behind him, and another shadowed figure appeared next to the other ones. This one almost 3 times as big with the number 0 flashing next to it. This villain is a hazard you gotta watch out for. And even if you do beat it, it's worth 0 points. Anything can happen in the hero biz, after all. I see. It's like a boss in a video game. The teen muttered to himself, something Izuku could only hear because he was close to him, before raising his voice once more. I apologize for being rude. The pro-hero waved off his concerns good-naturedly. Anyway, I think that's enough explain out of me. Remember, everyone, a great hero by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte once said, a true hero never stops overcoming the misfortunes in life. President Mike grinned. Now, let's get this thing started. Plus ultra. He shouted the school's motto. I hope you all have fun. Line the replica city stood proudly in front of the group Izuku was assigned to. He had flipped though the handout as he was waiting to go as some groups went before his. With a look around him, he couldn't see anyone he recognized, which did well to settle his nerve a little bit as the only other person from his school that had applied to you was Kakin, and competing against him now, even with all his progress, just wasn't something that Izuku thought he could do yet. The other competitors around him were dressed similar to him, in tracksuits and form-fitting clothing. Some of them had brought objects with them that they were either holding or affixing to their body somehow. Support items that allowed them to use their quirks more effectively. The teen that had stood up in the lecture earlier was staring seriously at the giant door in front of them, wearing a skin-tight suit that cut off above his calves to reveal unnaturally square shins and what looked to be multiple exhaust pipes sticking out from the back. Given the placement of his quirks and the physical effects it had on his legs, it was most likely an engine-based speed-enhancing quirk. Anything more specific would require seeing him in action, but Izuku felt like that was probably an accurate assumption. He refocused on the cityscape in front of him. It was truly huge. It was almost half the size of Izuku's entire town, although none of the buildings exceeded 5 stories. Not that that was somehow unimpressive, but it was something to note at the very least. Would he be able to get to the top of one of those things and use it effectively within 10 minutes? Probably not. It would be better to focus on moving along the ground and taking out as many of the artificial villains as he could. President Mike, who was standing in an observation tower opposite the giant entrance, cleared his throat, and everyone turned towards him expectantly. "Start!" he shouted. Like a shot, Izuku immediately tuned towards the entrance and started running sprint. He activated the skill and immediately sped up another 40% as denoted by the skill's description. It wouldn't do for him to be left behind by his. Izuku slowed to a stop and turned on his heel to stare at the crowd of teens behind him who hadn't moved an inch, most of which were staring at him in what looked to be abject shock. Faintly, Izuku could hear President Mike in the distance. "Well, what are you waiting for? There ain't going to be a countdown in real life. Follow that kid's lead and get out there." As if a SWCH had been flipped, the rest of the group fell over themselves to turn around and race into the arena. Izuku couldn't help but grin as he twisted quickly back into the course and reactivated his sprint. He was already ahead of his competitors. There was no way he wasn't going to ace this exam. And with that boost of confidence, he got started. The first villain came hard and fast. Around the first corner, he turned into quickly revealing that the artificial villains that they were due to fight were robots. It was dark green in color and had large segmented armor covering its body, leading up to a bulbous red camera that acted as a head, glowing menacingly in Izuku's general direction. There was a number 1 painted on the side. There was no time to waste. Izuku rushed forwards with all his enhanced speed and moved his fist forwards into the robot. "-5 HP SHD, Izuku exclaimed, jumping backwards to avoid a retaliatory strike from the machine. Perhaps punching metal wasn't the best of his ideas, but it was exactly what he needed. The resulting backlash didn't do any more damage than his punching the tree in his clearing did, and it gave him all the information he needed. The metal was dented, his natural strength and unwavering body were, in combination, strong enough to bend metal. Izuku ducked under another swing of the robot before leaping forwards. Chi manipulation. The ability to use the physical force present in every human, the life energy of the universe, running through his body and the 8 gates. At least that's what a cursory search on the internet had told him. To Izuku, it felt like a warmth pooled into 8 distinct places inside his body, 8 cores of strength to pull on, and pull he did. He channeled the chi closest to his right shoulder into his arm and through the veins, letting it seep through the muscle and veins, giving him an almost X-ray view of the inside of his body, imprinted onto his mind. And activating the skill Chi Strength Enhancement, it took less than a second to pull and settle the energy into his arm, and struck -10 MP. The metal of the robot caved inwards from the force. Its shattered insides forced out from under the thick armor through any gap available. The light in its eye went out, and it crashed to the ground. Izuku stood in awe of what he had done, still in the punching pose, his fist smoking slightly from the contact. That was much better than his experiment back in the clearing, when he had first created the ability Chi Strength Enhancement. Not a very creative name, he realized, but he was in quite a bit of shock at the time. The first time that he had used it, it had felt like his arm had shattered and his HP dropped 50 points. If it weren't for the fact he healed with every sleep, he definitely wouldn't have been comfortable enough with his own safety to fight today. As it turned out, strength enhancement didn't directly result in durability, and the backlash that would normally take away a small amount of health had risen exponentially. This, of course, resulted in him creating chi reinforcement and very nervously punching the tree again, which resulted in a much more satisfying timber moment with the tree crashing to the ground, its trunk splintered into smithereens. It seemed these robots would fall just as easily. Izuku grinned and started running forwards again, leaping over the smoking remains of the down machine. 1 point down, plenty more to go. The next group he encountered included a 3-pointer and 2 2-pointer robots. It only took a moment to notice the small rockets. The 3-pointer was already aiming at him. What the F? How dangerous was this exam exactly? There was no time to think, however, and channeling chi into his legs, he leapt over one of the 2-pointers, using his naturally enhanced body to twist himself around above it and land in a crouch position facing the direction he came in. A robotic fist sailed over his head, and the second two-pointer robot successfully destroyed the one he had just flipped over, not fast enough to stop its already moving attack. Moving quickly, Izuku fell to the floor, onto his hands, and channeled chi into his legs before Buck kicking the robot behind him, destroying it, just as he had the first, and sending its body flying into the three-pointer. The resulting impact and subsequent damaging of the about-to-fire missiles creating a very satisfying, if absolutely horrifying, miniature explosion, managing to completely destroy both robots and scattering the remains. What would happen if those missiles would hit me? It didn't bear thinking about. Izuku shook his head. There wasn't time for this. The exam was only 10 minutes, and he didn't know how long he had been fighting. Hopefully he was doing better or just as well as everyone else. 8 points down. Line the control room for the exam was packed with pro heroes, the teachers of UA. Each one was staring intently at either a personal screen in front of them or a set of multiple screens covering the wall in front of them. On every single one of the screens was a teen wannabe hero taking the UA exam. 3 of the tests had already finished, and only 2 were still going on, but the majority of the room's attention was locked on the test that had just started. Group D was the 5th and 3rd to last exam group for the day. It was also Izuku's group. Hey, did you see that? One of the teachers called out, this green-haired kid just took out 3 robots in a second. It was quite impressive, another one of them supplied. He only actually hit one of them and made the others take each other out. One of the teachers standing in the back of the room, wearing a black bodysuit and an excessive length of scarf around his head, narrowed his eyes through his long hair. It's not often you see one with more than just power this early on. Eraserhead shifted in his stance. Why aren't we watching rest of them? Cementas, one of the other teachers, looking more stone than man with his solid gray skin and blocky features, responded, they haven't arrived at the first wave yet. They all fell for Mixed Trick except this kid, really. Eraserhead said before grinning at a shot of Izuku knife-handing his way through the thin neck of one of their robots in what was clearly a well-executed martial arts technique. Interesting. Line 32 points down. Izuku wiped a sleeve across his brow. Not that he actually sweated, but as habitual at this point, and gave him an excuse to stand and watch his fellow examinees for a moment as he waited for the residual pain in his arms and legs to fade. He didn't have infinite stamina, and overuse still caused pain, although it faded as quickly as the rest of it. He was also down 200 points of mana, and a random strike from a robot had taken off another 10 HP. So, 305 MP and 86 HP, both of which were very slowly regenerating, neither of which he was worried about. He had already achieved a large amount of points and could see that there were plenty of robots still streaming from in around the buildings. His competitors were doing impressively too. Izuku had never seen so many people openly using their quirks to fight before and had to resist the urge to pull a notebook out of his inventory and start cataloging everything he could see. There was a boy with 3 sets of arms connected by webbing, standing on the top of a building opposite him. He had morphed the top 2 hands of his arms into giant ears, and they were twitching in every direction. Some sort of sonar, perhaps, locating robots to take out. Another kid was propelling himself across the road with a blindingly bright laser shooting out of his navel, leaving the remains of a shattered robot in his wake. Judging by the lack of any melted parts and the fact that it was physically sending him backwards instead of just being shot out, suggested that it was concussive rather than heat-based. Izuku wondered whether the kid would be able to fire it standing still and not be shot backwards. Another small kid, almost half of Izuku's height, dressed in a purple tracksuit with large purple ball sticking out of his head instead of hair, ran in his line of sight, desperately detaching and throwing the purple ball at the duo of 2 pointers chasing him. Each detached ball was immediately replaced by another regrowing in its place. The thrown ball stuck to whatever they hit, the robots, the floor, the walls, but none of them seemed to be doing anything useful. The kid didn't seem to know what he was doing with them, but the robots were still attacking and the danger was very much still real. The kid stumbled and fell to the floor before attempting to struggle backwards from the still advancing machines. Izuku rocketed forwards. There was no hesitation in his movements, sprint activated, and chi almost being forced through his legs, and he still only barely arrived in time. Izuku twisted around the first robot, drawing its attention from the scrabbling kid. Next, he channeled more chi into his left arm and leapt over the robot, grabbing onto a part of the exposed wiring through one of the gaps in its armor. He spun deftly in the air, bringing his body around in midair, pulling his left arm around and over his body, still grasping onto the robot's insides. The entire thing came with him, spinning in an arc over himself and into the second robot. The two came together in a resounding crash. Had Izuku been standing on the ground, he would have noticed it shaking slightly. 36 points down. Landing deftly in a crouch, Izuku turned to the awed and terrified teen, sitting heavily on the ground in front of him and the now wrecked robots. Izuku held out his hand to help the kid to his feet. "Are you all right?" he said. The purple kid didn't move, just staring at Izuku, mouth open and with tears in his eyes. Why you?" the teen stuttered. "You saved me." The kid was in shock, so of course there was only one thing Izuku could think of to get him to snap out of it. Izuku grinned as wide as he could. "It's all right. I'm here now," and gestured his helping hand again. The kid let out a snort of laughter. "Who are you supposed to be, All Might?" and grabbed the hand, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. "That was incredible." "Thanks, it felt pretty incredible." Izuku grinned wider. He had just saved someone's life. Izuku looked around them. His competitors were chewing their way through the robots. With this many people crowded up, it was difficult to figure out who was destroying what. It was also concerning, as he hadn't seen this many of them since the start of the exam. There mustn't be a lot of robots left in the rest of the city. The central street they were on probably contained what was left. "I kind of need to get back to the exam, if you're all right." The purple teen seemed to snap out of whatever he was feeling. Right, of course. "I'll let you get back to it," he said. And then in a smaller voice, "Maybe I'll just hide somewhere until it's over, hey?" The teen's attention was brought back to Izuku. "That was just bad luck. I'm sure you could be a fantastic hero. You shouldn't give up just yet." Izuku shot him a thumbs up. "There's still time left." Yeah, I guess." The teen still looked unsure, but at least he wasn't crying or in shock anymore. Usually Izuku would stay by just to make sure that would be all right, but there likely wasn't that much time left on the exam. "My name's Izuku Midoriya, by the way. I'm Minoru Mineta introduced. Izuku grinned his all-might smile again. "I'll look forward to seeing you at you. Hey." With that, he ran off back into the fray. He didn't see Mineta raise his hand in goodbye before freezing at Izuku's last words. He turned to look at one of the smaller, as of yet undestroyed, one-pointers. "Maybe I'll give it one more shot," Mineta mumbled. Line 47 points down. After the meeting with Mineta, he had managed to find a group of 3 three-pointers and had gotten them to take each other out with their own missiles before manually taking down another 2 one-pointers the others had ignored with a well-executed, enhanced roundhouse. Every little bit helped, and besides, with everyone else grouping up against the bigger targets, 4 out of 5 of them weren't getting any points at all. It really wasn't logical. By this point, there were barely any villains left, and almost everyone he had seen at the entrance was piled up in the main city street, where he was now. He noticed that most of the teens were aimlessly standing around, while others were agitatedly looking in every direction they could, or counting numbers on their fingers agitatedly. "Is the exam over then?" Izuku questioned to himself. As if in answer to his question, the wall of the fake city exploded inwards. The ground shook violently, and Izuku struggled to keep his step, and an almost deafening mechanical whirring echoed through the arena. He felt sorry for anyone with an ear-based quirk. Finally regaining his standing, Izuku managed to see the thing that had caused the noise. The 0-pointer had arrived, and it was massive. The thing was bigger than a skyscraper and absolutely towered over the competitively smaller buildings surrounding them. The people closest to the colossal feet pulling the monstrosity forwards immediately started shouting and screaming and ran away as fast as they could. Nobody tried to fight the thing. It wasn't worth anything, despite the massive size, so obviously everyone headed in the exact opposite direction. Only a moron would actually attempt to fight the thing. And so, with everyone else, Izuku made to turn around and run with everyone else. Hell, even if he wanted to fight that thing, he couldn't. The smaller robots were fine, but dented metal wouldn't really do much to that thing. And with under 200 MP left, he wouldn't dare. A girl screamed help. Immediately, Izuku stopped moving his search for the person in need. Oh, SHD. He found her quickly, the only person not running from the zero-pointer, and she wasn't running because she was trapped under some rubble directly in front of it, her leg caught in between some of the fallen concrete. The foot behind her rose skywards. Sprint! Izuku exclaimed before pushing himself towards her, forcing more chi than he ever had into his legs. Minus 50 MP. Now wasn't the time to conserve his energy. If he didn't do something, this girl would die. Had anyone else even noticed her yet? Izuku ran as fast as he could towards the monstrosity, weaving quickly between the panicking teenagers around him. At this point, he was moving fast enough to be considered a blur, but he was still too far away. The foot started to lower. It was only with its massive size that it was moving so slowly, something that was at his advantage. Not that it would make much difference if he didn't get there in time. Come on, Izuku shouted, staring directly into the eyes of the girl he needed to save. The girl that was staring back at the only person running towards instead of away from her, tears streaming from her eyes. 20 feet away. 10 feet. 5 feet. The foot was too low. It was almost on top of her now. There was no time to run in and get her out. He had to figure out something, and fast. 2 feet. There was only one thing he could do. Reinforcement. Izuku shouted, activating his skill manually as well as channeling the chi, as if doing both at once would double the effect. Izuku leapt at the girl, quickly wrapping his body around hers, with his on top. The foot came down. Thank you for joining us on this journey through What If Deku Had Gamer Power? We hope you found it as captivating as we did. A big thank you to Emrys Akayuki for creating such an engaging story. Don't forget to visit their profile on fanfiction.net for more fantastic works. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Zenin Fanfics for more intriguing explorations into fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we love hearing your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section. See you soon in the next video.